Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. Today, what I want to do is give you some tips so that your final assignments can be some of your very best ones. I'm thinking about the parable of the sower. I'm going to give some suggestions based on that particular assignment. First thing is, when you want to upgrade your work, I want to mention a couple of formatting or method issues that tend to affect beginning students, including some in our own class. And those things would just be a couple ones. The first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you avoid making applications during interpretive work. Remember, we're interpreting, we're trying to gain as much as possible insight into what Matthew was attempting to communicate in his context through his letters, with the assumption being he wasn't directly addressing us. So in inductive Bible study, we do survey, interpretation, and then once we've gained a sense of what Matthew was attempting to communicate, then we reflect on how Matthew's words come into our 21st century context. That's in the processes known as evaluation and application, which we're not working on this semester. So what you want to do is you want to remember that your implications and the inferences that you draw off the evidence that you cite, those aren't applications. And one of the easiest ways to avoid making that mistake is don't use "this means to me," "this tells us," "we must." So just avoid all that first person language and instead write your observations and your inferences, implications in a third person style. Okay, that's a critical piece. So you could say this suggests that Matthew was. So make yourself go the extra step to keep it in third person description style from that perspective, and that'll help you avoid making applications. And again, I completely understand it. We read the scripture today, and most of you are here at Asbury because the Bible has an ongoing message. But if you apply too soon, you're likely to distort what Matthew's really trying to say. So stick with the process. The other formatting issue is a pretty easy fix. Remember that you're going to be dialoguing with commentaries. So don't write your final synthesis, your final answers to the questions that you're working on until after you do your commentary review. Don't just stick the commentary review on the end. Do all your different uses of evidence. So do your contextual work, add in any other sources of evidence, and then your last piece of evidence will actually be your dialogue with commentaries, and then write a final synthesis, which is your final take, your final interpretation of the passage. And then make sure you include the documentation for that. Now, I also want to talk about other possible sources of evidence. So thinking about the work on Matthew 13, which was the interpretation of the parable of the sower or the soils, along with Jesus's explanation for using parables. What are some required sources that you need to use? Well, for all assignments, the minimum requirements are context. That's going to be your immediate context, the segment, and then broader book. So for the parable of the sower, your immediate context essentially would have been 1 to 23. But then as you had time, you should have also reflect on what else do the parables in all of Matthew 13, how does that influence our smaller sections? And then also think about broader book. What evidence can we get from the Gospel of Matthew to help? Now, of course, in our work, the immediate context is going to have the most space devoted to it because that's where you're going to be doing your detailed analysis, but you can glean evidence and make inferences from broader sources within Matthew. And then, of course, you'll be dialoguing with commentaries. But what else could you add? What else could you use to strengthen your work? And this is a question that we often get, and students raise this. So if we're thinking about the parable of the sower, think about this. How do the other parables? This would be a segment level kind of thing. How else does Matthew 13, how do the other parables illuminate the parable of the sower or the soils, or even what Jesus says in terms of the meaning of parables? How do the quotations that we find in the early part of Matthew 13, the quotation from Psalm 78 about parables, or the quotation from Isaiah 6 about the reason that Jesus uses parables. Go back in the Old Testament and study that original context and see how does that illuminate the meaning in Matthew 13. You can also look up historical background, and I'm going to give some resources in the next slide, but use historical background, look up things like farming practices, teaching practices. Whenever you come across in a text geographical information or customs or actions that you don't understand, try to look those things up using historical background. And you can also look up gospel parallels. So for example, how do Luke and Mark, in this case, use the parable of the sower? Are there any insights from the context in those gospels? And as we've already been doing, can also use word studies. So you want to look at those things, and again, look at other videos that I've already shot for the class to help you use some of these determinants, but you want to expand the sources of evidence that you use. Of course, you also want to look at the suggestions for improving analysis and interpretation. That will help you a lot. Now, what are some resources that you can use for historical background? I suggest Bible dictionaries, and here's a couple: Erdman's Dictionary of the Bible, HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. Erdman's is from around 2000. HarperCollins is fairly recent, so you want to always use a recent dictionary. Don't try to go back more than 30 years tops. Craig Keener, who's a professor of New Testament at Asbury, has a great book. It's a one volume. He goes through all 27 of the books of the New Testament, verse by verse, and cites relevant historical data. It's the IVP Bible Background Commentary. And for places, geography, you can look at Bible atlases, including IVP Atlas of the Bible or the HarperCollins Concise Atlas of the Bible. Well, those are a few hints. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, and I'm also attaching the notes to this slideshow, so you can just have the notes as well. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing your excellent work. Again, I'm Brian Russell, and we'll see you next time.